Keep Talking exists to have conversations that might help to make a better society and a better culture. As humans, talking openly to each other is one of the key tools we have to gain knowledge, to seek the truth, to foster curiosity, to exchange and explore ideas, to see nuance, to ask big questions, to defend individual liberty, to resist ideology and tribalism, to heal and develop, to glean insight, to learn from history, to change our minds. And in that spirit, I believe that each guest has important information and stories to share. This show is also a deeply personal project for me to learn, to grow, to reduce my own ignorance, to try to make me a better human being and a better citizen. And it's something that I want to share. Eric Jorgenson is the author of the Almanack of Naval Ravikant. During our conversation, Eric and I talk about the creation of the book, the vacuum that's been created for advice and wisdom in a secular age, and the ideas in the book related to wealth, health, and happiness. I have been a massive Naval Ravikant fan for years. I have found his insights into life to be profound, true, memorable, and worth revisiting again and again. In my mind, Naval represents some of the best of America. An immigrant, self-made, brilliant, grateful, free, and open to sharing the ideas that have guided his life. Naval has never written a book about those ideas, and that is the treasure of what Eric has created. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Eric Jorgenson. All right, Eric. Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for doing this and taking the time to have the conversation. I've wanted to do this for months. It's great to meet you and get to have talked to you for a little bit. Welcome to the show. It's good to have you on.
Thanks, Dan. It's an honor.
Thanks, man. I wanted to start with a mentality of someone listening to this who has no idea who this person is that we're about to talk about, and kind of begin fresh. And I'd love to kind of begin with your window into that by asking if you can remember how you became aware of Naval Ravikant in the first place, and what the process was for you to get really interested in who this man is, what his ideas are, et cetera.
Yeah, I'm kind of fortunate to remember this moment very distinctly, because it was part of just huge inflection point in my kind of young career or like world awareness. So I think I was, sophomore, junior in college. And I had just finished this like weekend hackathon thing called Startup Weekend. And one of the judges introduced our team to this guy, Bo Fishback, who became like a great mentor to me. But we had one meeting that was like scheduled for half an hour and just like went on and on and on, because we really like jived. And one of the things he told me was like, if you're going to build this company, you got to move to San Francisco. And this was 2011, so this is way more true than it is now. Yep. But the other thing you're going to want to do is go read like everything that Mark Andreessen, Paul Graham, and Naval Ravikant are writing on the blog was called Venture Hacks, and Nivi and Naval kind of co-wrote it. Yep. And he's like, these are the people that you need to read. And so I just like, yes, sir. And deep dove on those. And so that was like the beginning of my awareness, but following Naval on Twitter and picking up talks and stuff like that. So, probably 10 years now, I've been like reading whatever he's been talking about as those topics have shifted over time.
Yep. What did you know about him, if anything, at the time? And as you began to explore, his Twitter feed, his writings, what kind of a perception did you get of who he was?
I mean, I'd never heard of him until that moment. And I was 19. I didn't know anything about anybody. Despite what I thought I knew.
I identify with that too.
Yeah, no, it was, what they were mostly writing about was like the game theory of venture capital, right? So Naval early in his career had some successful startups that hadn't ended up well for him personally. And in understanding kind of what happened and battling through that, he really gained an appreciation for the nuances of like what's in a term sheet. When do investors, get their liquidity preference, their money back in different orders? What does it mean when certain founders have control or some founders leave the company? And so he just started writing about these things that were like a little bit behind the curtain. And in that era of Silicon Valley, things were much more investor friendly. Like they had a lot more leverage than entrepreneurs did. And that has shifted a little bit now, but he started just sharing, when venture capitalists are putting out 10 term sheets a year and you're looking at the first one of your life, like this is what you need to know in order to like understand what you're getting yourself into. And that was the very beginning of it. But he built AngelList kind of off the top of that blog and the following that he got from that blog. And so shifting from like, here's how the venture world works to here's how I'm personally building my startup was probably the first of kind of those long shifts of what he was sharing at the time that he was working on.
When I think about Naval currently, and this is one of the subjects I wanted to approach with you, in an era in which religion is fading in American culture in terms of its general historic influence, there does seem to be a vacuum for other individuals who have outlooks and principles on life and philosophy that there's clearly a hunger for. And he seems to be, in my mind, especially with a certain cohort of the population, someone people really go to for advice, for help, for guidance, in a way that I don't know that I'm aware of someone else who has. There are people who have a bigger following than Naval, but like in terms of the people who are familiar with who he is and what he stands for, the devotion, that's probably the wrong word, but just the respect that is due to him in terms of the insight and the depth of his mind. To me, he comes maybe number one of anyone that I'm familiar with currently. What you talked about his business ideas and his business influence. Do you remember the time, if there was one, in which you realized there is this whole side to his life related to business, but there's really a lot more there that this guy's interested in conveying and talking about?
Yeah. I mean, I don't remember the shift specifically. I'm sure it was gradual over time. And if actually I went back through the materials, I could probably pinpoint a year. I'm going to guess it was like around 2016, 17 that he kind of, and I think the way he puts it is like, I basically achieved the material and social successes that I set out to early in my life and that I thought would resolve the desires and the conflicts that I had in myself. And upon arriving at the top of that mountain, found that they didn't. And went through that kind of journey of like, oh, what I thought was the goal isn't the goal. And the quote from, I think, a friend of his is like, you're a smart guy. And if you're so smart, like, why aren't you happy? And he kind of applied his type A-ness to like, okay, I'm going to treat this like a happiness project. And I'm going to approach and solve, my own happiness in the same way that I approached, business problems or social and material success. And just like read and synthesize and take notes and share and meet people and work at it, like truly like try to build the habits and break them down and understand like what the atomic units are and the steps that need to go into changing that and what actually needs to change to drive your own happiness. And it was I think a really big departure from what he'd been talking about from 2007 to 2016, let's say. But it also attracted a lot of people who really identified with kind of like you're saying, the secular struggle of like no idols, no guidebook. And like I personally, as I've observed Silicon Valley culture, I think it's really interesting to watch us like break down and then recompile all of these like timeless habits and practices that religion has bundled together into like secular things. Like, we don't pray anymore, but like now we meditate, and we don't have, Ramadan or like feasting holidays, but we do intermittent fasting. And, we don't have like church every Sunday, but we have online communities, and like on and on and on of these things where we're rediscovering these things and recompiling them in ways that work for us, that, religion has been handing us on a silver platter for a long time. We're trying to kind of see which pieces like still serve us in different combinations.
Yeah. When I was a kid, I was a firm believing, altar serving Catholic. And there was a brief period in my life where my parents tell the story about how I was interested in becoming a priest. And that there was something to the contemplation and the depth and the silence that really spoke to me. And I have always, I think you're right. Like as you break apart religion, people need a way to frame the world that makes sense to them, that kind of brings the world and brings principles into a perspective that they can use to kind of guide their life. I remember Naval saying once that, roughly speaking, that all people want three things. Everyone wants to be happy, everyone wants to be wealthy, and everyone wants to be fit. And I basically to be healthy. In speaking to you, there's so much that he covers in your book. There's so many principles in there, and the ones that I would really love to focus on are the ones that really stick with you. The ones that in your life, in your research of him, you would rank order as these ideas, these principles seem to really carry most of the weight or the majority of the weight. As I begin to articulate that, I'm curious if there's anything in that as a starting point, you think about often, whether it's the wealth, the happiness, or the fitness, the health in general, that you think is worth kind of conveying and reiterating to people.
Yeah, there's a lot of them, which is like partly why I wanted to do this, and also probably a product of the project is I've just spent a lot of time with these ideas. So kind of as they come to mind, like the first is probably that there's a voice in your head that is malleable and trainable and changeable. I think a lot of people, and Naval points this out, like take their feelings or their first reaction or their emotional reaction as like a fixed thing, and then like go try to change the world in order to reflect that, instead of realizing that they can change that voice and train it, and in doing so, like change the environment inside their own head and improve, like, because that's so much of what determines your happiness is just those instincts and those voices and what those kind of values are telling you. I think to your point about health, like there's not kind of, section by section, there's not a lot about health in this book, because Naval says like, I have not dedicated my life to studying health in the way that I have happiness or wealth. And I started from the bottom and came up strong in both wealth and happiness and feels qualified to talk about those. He's like, there's a lot of resources about health you should take in, and here's maybe some directions to head, but that's not his focus. But the foundation of all of it, I think, which Naval does make in this point in the book, is that health is the most core important thing. Like it comes before, and it may be the most staggering. He's like, my health comes before my family's health, not because I don't care about them even more than I care about myself, but because I can't care for them if I do not first care for myself. And so with that set of priorities, he's like, I wake up every day and I work out first thing. It is my first priority. And so I do it first. And then I take care of my family, and then I take care of my business, and then I take care of, all of the other things in my life. But if I sacrifice my health to achieve these other things, they become worthless, which is is an iron principle, and it's a very helpful and interesting one. Another thing is that this is probably the specific line that got me to feel like I had to do this project. And it's a small idea, but I remember distinctly hearing it on the Knowledge Project podcast with Shane Parrish. And he's like, it was his solution for envy. He's like,
I love this one. Yeah.
It's so good. He's like, nobody talks about envy or jealousy. We all have it, but we're all like ashamed that we have it, and we're driven by it in so many ways. And I think that like Buffett quote of like, it's not greed that drives the world, but envy, is super pertinent. And realizing that there is a simple cure for envy, and that if you are not willing to swap wholesale 100% for 100% your life with somebody else's, like you can't envy their six pack or their money or their, spouse without feeling like you are willing to give up everything that they gave up in order to accomplish that, their insecurities, their sacrifices, their, emotional trauma, their whatever. And if you're not willing to make that full swap, then there's no sense being jealous of like picking and choosing individual traits to be jealous of, because you're just gonna be miserable forever seeing the best of everybody else and focusing on the gaps that you are. You have to look at the whole person. And that was like, I don't know, it felt like a bucket of water in the desert, like at that particular moment. I was like, God, that's so helpful. I want everybody who ever needs to know this, like hear this paragraph, to hear it. And it's like buried, an hour into a podcast that only a few 100,000 people subscribe to. Shit, that is so timeless and so important. And I just want to do whatever work is necessary to preserve that and distribute it, and like let as many people as possible access that same relief or that same benefit that I got.
Yeah. And that's it. I'm really glad you brought that up, because that is something that I want to dig into with you, which is the process and the reason you took so much energy and time. I told you before the interview started that I wrote a book about 10 years ago, and it's probably the hardest thing I've ever done in my life, at least intellectually and work wise. So I know the grind, and I know
how long did it take you?
It took me 3.5 years.
Yeah.
And I thought it would probably take me about a year. And there's just so many unforeseen obstacles, right? You're laughing as I tell you that, because you don't know what you don't know. And man, I'm glad I was so naive before I started, because I'm not sure I would have done it without that fact. So I said this to you too before we started talking, that like there is no way you would have put yourself through that kind of suffering unless you thought it was worth it. There was something there that must have kept you going when it was you very easily could have moved on with your life and given it up and not done it. And I would love to spend a little bit of time digging into that as to what it is. And you alluded to this, I think, in your last comment, why it mattered to you so much to do this.
Yeah. I mean, there's a very noble answer here, which is that, what I elucidated before was like, oh, it was so important to me to get this out into the world and to share it with everybody. There's also like the very selfish reason of like, I loved spending time with this material. And I feel like every hour that I spent reading this and recompiling it and re-editing and doing more research and finding new ways for these ideas to fit together, every hour just made me better. And so I was happy to keep doing that work, because I loved the process of learning, and I learned it to such a higher bar than I would have if I was just trying to like, okay, let me just listen to it and like absorb what I can absorb and then move on and go listen to something else. I spent, to your exact point, I laughed because I was like, oh, 6-month project, and 3 years later, like here we are. So there's definitely like, it was a lot of time. But the third answer, which is probably the practical answer, is that like I felt like I had no choice, because I was accidentally publicly committed to not just thousands of people on Twitter, but Naval himself, to ship something, because I had a half-assed idea and I tweeted it out, and then Naval supported it and said he was happy to help. And so like I had the world's biggest fish hook in my mouth to get this thing over the finish line. And I knew I was going to publish something, and my biggest fear was that it just wasn't going to be good enough. Yeah. So it wasn't a question of like, there wasn't a timeline. I gave myself as much time as I needed, and there wasn't a doubt in my mind that I would like hell or high water publish something. So I really just trapped myself in every dimension except quality, and then just channeled that into trying to make it better and better and better and better. And my criteria for what that meant changed over time as I got more familiar with it. But I think it was helpful to have those parameters, and just keep chugging.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it sounds like it started with an idea and an impulse that this was something you were in a unique situation to do and to create. How did you even begin that process, right? Did you have a connection to Naval in the first place? How did you broach the subject with him and actually get access to him where he was interested in helping with this?
I mean, dude, this was such a like happy accident, because I had no connection. I had no prior relationship. I had been studying him or reading, following for a long time, but we'd never spoken or talked or messaged or anything. And I tweeted this kernel of an idea. It was literally like a dumb pun on a Twitter poll. Like it was a joke. And it would have been very dismissible, but for the fact that Naval retweeted it, and I woke up to find like 5,000 people had said like, yes, I want to do this. And Naval replied and said like, hey, I'm happy to give you the material that you need, and, wish you well, like go for it. And I was like, oh shit. This just got like very real very quickly. And with your permission, like like, I will now expand the scope of this project massively. And, my first idea was like, oh, I'll spend a few months on it and like put together something with duct tape and move on to the next project. And with Naval's support, I was like, oh shit, like, now I want to make Poor Charlie's Almanack for you. Like, I want something amazing and timeless that is going to be like something that you are proud of having be a part of the thing that the people who are attracted to you read and, gift and get attached to and use for decades, which totally changed my relationship to the project. And I'm forever grateful for that happy accident. Because I truly don't know if I would have finished it or if I would have been able to, or if I would have done it to the quality level that I did without that pressure and that buy-in. Even though it was, 5 seconds of effort from him, it like meant a lot to me. And I'm with no context. I'm like, I don't think he did any diligence or anything. I think it was just like, sure, kid, go for it. And I've seen him do it for 20 other people who have also, like, many of whom have also shipped amazing projects, whether they're, compilations or illustrated versions of his work or posters or whatever.
So once you get the go ahead from him, what's the next step? Did you begin to compile more and more of his information? How did you even start? How did you begin the project in the first place?
It was, so step one was like start building a resource list. So we got up to probably 100 different podcasts and interviews and blog posts and articles about him and different things that he'd written or appeared on. And then the other was an export of his Twitter history. So this is all like public information. The only thing that's not super, super public is like the deep history of tweets. I think like only the couple thousand most recent are accessible. But I started with those tweets and I went through and just kind of filtered them. I read everything, 20,000 tweets, like filtered them for, quality, timeless, and then did another pass of categorization. And those categories became my first outline. I probably went through 4 or 5 different like outlines and structures as things got iterated over time, but those are the buckets. And then I started pulling in stories and ideas and examples and stuff from the other resources that I'd compiled. I think that the napkin math was probably well over 1 million words of source material. It was a long time of just, reading and sorting. And it sort of felt like doing a giant, like, conceptual jigsaw puzzle where you had to just like empty the box on the table and start sorting stuff. And, you have to kind of pick up a piece and like try to grok it and figure out like where the seams are and then figure out what other pieces it goes with. And, when you get them all right, the reader should feel like you're very seamlessly progressing from idea to idea, and each passage sort of begets a question, and the next passage should answer the question that the reader comes up with as they're going through. But those passages might be from, one's from a podcast in 2017 and one's from a blog post in 2020. But when you put them together, like, the question answers itself and keeps you moving through these ideas. And it just takes a long time to figure out where all those seams are and where they fit together well. But when you sit down and read it, and people are like, I literally read this in one sitting in 4 hours in a flight, and I like did not stop turning pages. I'm like, that is a seamless reading experience, even though there's 1,000 seams in there, like you didn't notice them, and that's perfect. That makes me very, very happy.
Had you been a writer prior to this? I'm curious what your background is related to this kind of compilation and just writing in general. What's the background?
I have written like a lot, but I don't like, I have no formal training. I was not an English major. I did like very few to no classes that required me to ever like write. But though I did like a lot of, I've always been a reader, and I have done other projects that are, I've written plenty of blog posts. I've done some compilations that are similar, that are like curations and synthesis kind of work of business topics. So I used to run a blog called Evergreen that was like, every week we'd pick a topic and say like network effects. I'd send out to this email list, a few thousand people, and say like, send me the best thing you've ever read, watched, or listened to on network effects. And then I would try to like smash all that stuff into my head and spit out this like 10-minute summary of the main ideas and link back to all the original material. So if you want to spend 10 minutes reading and get an overview, because it's the first time you've ever heard of a network effect, then you can read the post. If you want to spend 3 hours and get a masterclass of like, here's the 5 best resources of all of the 100 that people sent me, like here, read these 5, and you can spend a few hours and get up to speed. So that was kind of like, I don't know, high iteration, like reps of this that I had no idea was going to like build this skill set, but I think it did in some ways. But I think just having been, I don't know, just be like the temperament to happily like swim around in this content, and the agency to like feel confident moving it around and like trying to put things together, like I think is all it took. And what I'm interested in is like, this is my version, but like somebody else could have set out with the exact same parameters and come up with a very different book just based on what they were interested in and how they interpreted ideas and how they put them together. And so, you know, if somebody else tried to do, you know, if you tried to do like Dan's Almanack of Naval, like you might end up picking very different passages and arranging them in a very different way. And it might change readers or reach readers in a very different way, which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah. And when you floated this idea out initially, which it sounded like was half a joke, did you include your qualifications in there from this perspective? No. Or like, were you just literally some guy on the internet floating this idea out on Twitter?
I mean, I was literally some guy on the internet floating this out on Twitter. So at that point I probably had, I don't know, 10,000 Twitter followers maybe. Yep. So like there was some inherent like proof of work in that, like it wasn't a brand new like egg of a Twitter account with no followers. And I have no idea if, you know, Noel spent an hour looking at my past work and saying like, oh, this guy's like not a goober, like we'll do it. Or if he DM'd somebody who he saw we had mutually in common. I have no idea. I've never asked. But I've also seen him, like I said, you know, support other people who propose projects that kind of remix his work. So it may just be his habit to like say, sure, kid, go for it. As many times as he gets asked. And as long as people are sort of in the spirit of his sharing in the spirit of his content, then I think it, you know, it only benefits him and benefits everybody, really.
Yeah. When you're going through these like various drafts and you're building over the months and years here, how involved is he in that process? Is it really just you trying to like iterating, making better, improving, going back to the drawing board, editing more, and then periodically once a year you're sending him a document to see if roughly it's in line with what he's hoping for? Or did you have full creative control? What was the story there?
Yeah, more the latter. Well, I can't remember how many scenarios there were there. Basically, like I would work. And then I'd be like, this is like maybe a milestone. Like I'll just send him this version and like show him that I'm still making progress. And like literally probably every 6 months to a year was like, hey, making progress. Here's the status. And he'd be like, you know, here's the, looks good, or like, wow, that's a lot, or like whatever. You know, he never, to my knowledge, did like a deep dive. He did not request. He requests a final edit, and he's like, you know, if there's something I don't want, like I'm going to ask you to remove it. But he never did that. And I don't know. I have no intentions but to like produce something super useful for the reader and like just pull all of the most useful stuff that Naval has ever said. So I'm, you know, there's no attempt to like scoop anything or smear anybody or do anything other than like benefit readers with the best of Naval. Like that was the goal of this project, really. So I didn't expect any conflicts, and we never had any. And I truly don't think he ever read word for word like what was in the book. I think he like flipped through it and was like, yeah, I said most of that stuff. But we're also very careful to like, there's a lot of passes with like a sanding block over this stuff. And like by definition, everything is taken out of context. So what neither of us wanted was for him to get a world of shit for something that was in this book that got taken out of the original context and then reworded and then edited and then proofread and then moved into a different chapter and then like there's all kinds of ways that like things can go wrong as over time, like interpretations and meanings change and all this stuff. So it should be clear that it is like not a primary source, even though what I did was with every intention was to like show Naval's ideas in his own words. And, past the author's note, like there's not an original word in this book. It is all as close as I could get straight from Naval, edited for readability and sort of, I don't know, smoothness of reader experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and this is an element of his story that I would love to get your thoughts on. I mean, outside of being just naturally a bright mind, what is it about his life? And I would love for you to speak about his life as whatever narrative makes sense to you about where he comes from and how he became who he is, that has led him to have whatever you would call it, a lot of practical philosophy. Like this, there's a Buddhist influence there. Who is this guy? Where does this kind of vast fountain of knowledge come from in his own personal story?
Yeah, I mean, well, he's super broadly read, and I think he and his partner Nivi are both very good writers, and specifically good writers in that they work very hard to make things increasingly succinct and dense in a good way, like to waste no words, to write a 200 word post when everybody else would write 1,000 word post. Yep. That is no less clear or thorough, but is just tight. And you can see that in his tweets. He'll read a whole book or speech or piece of philosophy and then come back with 5 words on it, and it is like we all feel the truth in it and are kind of like, holy shit. And then somebody is like, well, that's a fortune cookie, and it's like, well, yeah, it is a compressed truth. But if you want to go read that whole paper and like try to come up with your own conclusion, like you're welcome to do that. But so in his life experience, in so many ways, it is a very broad and somewhat hard life experience. And I think it's a really interesting and kind of perfect representation of like the immigrant's American dream. Yeah. So he moved here at around age 10 with his brother, single parent household, like grew up with his mom, working multiple jobs. He worked in I think he's an illegal catering company was like his first job, like in the back of a van and, working in restaurants and stuff like that. And so like by no means a silver spoon. He definitely has, as you said, like great intellectual gifts. I think he had a kind of a breakout moment where he tested did well on a test in high school to get into Stuyvesant, which is like a high-end school in New York you probably know about. Yep. And from there, got into Dartmouth, like no mean feat, but like step by step. And then from Dartmouth kind of got into the world of tech. He learned software engineering and started to work for a few startups and had like a little bit of an auspicious, like first 10 years in the world of tech. He basically like started a company that ended up becoming successful, but he and many of his co-founders got screwed after they had left the company, got screwed by this co-founder who had remained and the venture capitalist. And so ended up with a little bit of a legal battle over that there's, public record and evidence of, if you want to kind of dig into it. And so by, 30, I think there's like headlines about him being like smeared in the valley because nobody sues their venture capitalists. You'll never work in this town again. And that was like the backdrop where he started kind of writing and blogging and just giving value to others, and then started emailing out deals through AngelList. Started becoming an investor. And, some of those early deals were Twitter and Uber. Actually like went out in AngelList when it was still just an email list. He invested in MySQL. He invested in Postmates. He was, I believe, an early investor in a cryptocurrency fund called Metastable. So there's a lot of, not only did he start AngelList, which has become a very successful kind of like, I don't know, almost like startup conglomerate, but also an amazing angel investor in his own right. And the portfolio that he's built is amazing. So and then, realizing like, oh, this was like the chip on my shoulder but I still have unresolved questions about living life that I'm going to go chase down now. And, to get off that like hedonic treadmill of accomplishment that he arguably had won that game, or at least, to his satisfaction, to the top 10th or 100th or 1,000th of a percent of the population. And to basically get off that treadmill and go find something else to focus his energy on.
Yeah. We talked a little bit earlier about the three areas that I recall him stating of human life that all people seem to want to prosper in. And you're right. I think I've heard him concede this point as well, that the health aspect of that, he probably has more information in his head than most people, but he doesn't consider himself to be an expert in that particular area. But I do think he has some very meaningful, clearly expertise related to wealth. And that's something I would love to focus on with you. I think personally, the reason why I love books like this is because the ideas and principles that you can obtain from a few days of reading can really stick with you and change your entire perspective and really help save you a lot of time and energy over your life to really direct you in the proper manner so that you're not having to reinvent the wheel and that you're kind of learning arguably timeless principles related to wealth creation, for example, that it might take someone 50 or 60 years to learn if they were just going out and living that life and having to learn those lessons themselves. Again, the only way I think to really obtain all of this is probably to buy your book and to read it and reread it, or listen to his podcast and re-listen. But in terms of like the primary principles that, and again, maybe for you, have stuck with you or you think carry most of the weight for his general outlook on wealth, what are those? What are the things that people really should focus on? If you had a close friend, they're like, what do I need to learn from Naval? I don't have time to listen to hours and hours of his podcast. What do I need to really sink in my own thinking?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a tough question to give a blanket answer on, just because everyone is starting from a little bit of a different place, right? So the things that jumped out to me when I first started compiling this and reading his his How to Get Rich tweet storm. So it's funny that tweet storm came out when I was like halfway through working on the book. I was like, oh, like this summarizes a lot of things that I was working very hard to summarize already from a lot of different sources, because he mentioned a lot of them individually, kind of dispersed across all these things. But that became like, that blew up. That's got to be one of the most saved threads, or highest impression threads on Twitter. And that's a very like tweet by tweet principles level thing. But if you're not able to like unfold one of those words like leverage into the 2-page definition of leverage, it's going to be hard for you to kind of grok that and like start to apply it. And so what I try to do in the book is like take each of the important concepts and show the explanation of it and show stories, and then order them in such a way that they kind of build on each other. Because, for example, like finding a position of leverage and like going to apply leverage to what you're working on is not the right place to start. But if you feel like you have locked down like your specific knowledge, you've got very unique skills that are valuable that you're applying to the market and seeing success with, and then you are in a place where you have taken on accountability, then you want to be adding leverage. But if you don't have 0 and you don't have 1 or 2 laid down, like, do not skip straight to leverage. You're going to have a bad time. So the order of the concepts is important, but understanding each of them and seeing as far as you can kind of down that ladder. To your point, right? Like, you do not want to spend 50 years of your life bumping into walls and slowly like mapping out this maze for yourself. If you can spend a few hours, reading this book and many others and like get a sense of this maze for yourself, see as far through the mist as you can and be like, there are rungs in this ladder past the ones that I can see today. And like, let me continue to take these steps in this order and reach for these things. It might even totally change your goals or your perspective on how you want your life to turn out. And I don't pretend like this is the only book in the world that does this or can do this, but I think word for word, it's got to be one of the most concise sort of representations of how you can go from no understanding of how to earn money beyond, a normal job income to, oh, this is almost all of how it works at a high level. And like, let me keep trying to explore these concepts and play this game. So we can try to go into some more of those, but like
Sure.
maybe that's a helpful overview.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I would love to do that.
Okay. So the first one probably like, both chronologically and like fundamentally, is the idea of specific knowledge, which is, I found to be quite a liberating concept, because this idea of like, we are all at our best. We are all moving towards being the best in the world at something, whether it's a combination of like our genetic gifts, our experiences, our interests, our talents. And when we are doing our highest value work, it is when we are doing the thing that only we can do. Right. You've worked in podcasting for a long time. You have a very unique set of interests. You are well prepared to have a very specific set of conversations. And when you find yourself having those conversations and sharing them with the people who are interested in those conversations, like, you are blossoming at your fullest and like contributing the most to humanity that you possibly can.
Yeah.
And when you are doing that, you are incredibly valuable. If you were working at McDonald's as a fry cook, you are no more valuable to humanity than the next person who's going to work as a fry cook at McDonald's and the person before you. So finding, your unique skills, interests, and talents, and becoming as unique and as valuable as you can, is kind of the fundamental thing. And it takes, as Naval says, it takes many years to like find that fit. Not only are you creating yourself as the key in this metaphor, but you are also sort of looking around the world for different locks and trying to inventory the locks that are available to you and all the different things that people need. And not just exploring what you can do for them, but also like changing yourself and figuring out what you can do for them, and combining different skills and stacking those skills makes you like increasingly unique and increasingly valuable. There's a great metaphor in the book of, is a little bit of a oversimplification, but if you can scuba dive deeper than anyone else in the world due to some combination of like your training or your bravery or the equipment that you've invented or bought or know how to use, and a new treasure is discovered at a depth that only you can dive to, you will be entitled to a share of that treasure by being the only person who can reach it. An actual like real metaphor is that Warren Buffett is the guy who gets the call when the whole American economy needs to be bailed out, because he's one, the only one with enough money, and two, the only one with the reputation to instantly change the sort of environment and the perspective of like retail investors when the economy is like in rapid collapse. We're like, oh, if Buffett's buying, we're good. That's an oversimplification of the whole financial crisis, but it is at least a real world metaphor of this example of specific knowledge and reputation and skill and experience and resources that you can kind of combine. And truly, it may be as simple as becoming like the best plumber in your town who always shows up on time and is the only one who saved up enough to have the very specific like mainline router clean out tool, and you're the only one in the city that has it. So you're going to make a bunch of money off that. Like that is as practical of an example as you can get, but the specific knowledge is like the right place to start this journey. And if you only nail that, you will still have a great outcome in life. But moving beyond that into some of these other concepts is where you start to truly have like, you get a sense of how people achieve these things that look just totally superhuman to the point of being like almost unfair. But when you see all of these steps put together of someone who has a very deep specific knowledge that is incredibly valuable, that has taken on massive accountability for themselves and their risks, and then has piled on huge amounts of leverage and pulled in capital and people to help them. And then you see somebody like Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, who's like the most resourced people alive. Like there's a reason for that. And it is because we have all conspired to give them more resources over the last decades because they have shown that they can accomplish incredible things when they have that leverage, and that they're willing to take the risk on of failing. And we are happy to support them and accept that they're taking those risks, and that we're a part of that by donating our time or our capital or our interest, our support, whatever it is, to like help accomplish the things that they set out to accomplish, because we all benefit from it at the end of the day.
Yeah. Yeah. I know I have heard him Naval speak about specific knowledge in basically every interview in which he is asked about wealth creation. And the other aspect, and there's a lot more there that I'm sure we can talk about, but the other piece of this that I know that he has harped on consistently is that to get wealthy, and maybe before I make this statement, I will note how I have viewed kind of his outlook on the purpose of money in the first place, which is, you used this phrase earlier, the hedonic treadmill, right? It isn't for increased material possessions necessarily. Obviously, comfort is a component of living a wealthy and comfortable life. But I think for him, the purpose of money was really autonomy. It was really freedom, and escaping the 9-to-5 rat race. There's a great line I remember him saying once in an interview, that if somebody can tell you where you have to be, how you have to dress, what meetings you have to attend to, you're not really free. You're not a free person. Someone, even if you're making $400,000 a year in Manhattan, you are still subject to another human being being able to control your life.
Some of the people with the highest incomes that I know are the least free people.
Yeah.
Right. Like if somebody's paying you $1 million a year, then they fucking own you.
And this is another one of his favorite. I have a quotes section on my website, and there are probably close to 300 or 400 quotes on there, and I would bet a quarter of them are Naval quotes. One of them is related to people who stop themselves. I'm paraphrasing here, but people who stop themselves from continuously upgrading their lifestyle possess a freedom that those who don't can't possibly fathom. Basically, that like, I think he's making the point there that we underestimate there are diminishing returns to luxury and comfort as you get to a certain baseline. And there's culturally right now, seemingly, and I think that might be shifting with our generation, there's an underappreciation for how much better your life might be if you did really own your time. If you could really go wherever you wanted to during the course of the day. Not that you wouldn't want to be productive in some manner, but you can get up when you want. You can stay up late if you're having a great conversation with a friend or a girlfriend. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really... I think it's an interesting point, and I wonder where the conspiracy around us not valuing our own time, like our leisure time specifically, right? I think a lot of people might at first blush be like, well, what, like, why would I even want to control my own time? Like, I'd rather have more consumption than more time. And I think that's like I don't know where that instinct comes from, aside from just like rampant marketing like efforts over the course of our whole lives. But I think another thing, I can't remember actually if this makes it into the book, but something else that he said that has stuck with me is this concept that like the hedonic adaptation is so much faster for man-made things than for natural things. I
fucking love that. Yeah.
Right. So like you get a new car and like you're over it in 2 months, but if you the joy of like gardening or going for walks, or to your point, like talking with friends around a campfire, or the things that are like rewarded deep in our genes and have been for generations, are significantly like our marginal utility curves to get way too economically technical are significantly more shallow for those things.
Yeah. I know I learned this about you before we started recording as well, that we're both kind of Midwestern boys. And I know in my own upbringing, I barely had ever gone to California. I didn't really know wealthy people when I was growing up. They weren't in my cohort or my community. And as I've gotten out there in spending a lot of time in California and really understanding a lot more, or being at least exposed to people in the investing world, how, and this is another quote that I've heard Naval say many times, which is the most important skill is judgment. And as it applies to wealth creation, you know, if in 1997, hypothetically, you had $5,000 or $10,000 of capital available to you, and you applied a judgment call that you were going to bet that this fledgling company called Apple was going to have a run with its new CEO and be able to actually be a wealth generating machine, versus some meddling company that you and I have never heard of that maybe had returns of 2 to 5% per year for the next decade. The difference in outcome in terms of what the result would be for your life 10 years afterwards is the difference between being a free person and not, really. And one of the things that I think excites me about our time, and this is, I think, part of the idea behind AngelList for Naval, is basically democratizing investing opportunities to normal people, and allowing people's judgment to be leveraged over time. And if you actually make a correct call, it can rapidly change your life in a way that I don't think I appreciated growing up, that was really how these rich people, that was primarily how they had done that. It wasn't that they worked harder than other people. It was that they had made bets that turned out to be significantly more correct than others.
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe the luckiest thing in my life is that I grew up in a house where that was discussed. Like I did not have to like battle for that insight. Like if I learned one thing, like from my dad specifically, it was like, your money can work harder than you can at some scale. Yeah. Right. And that, you know, if you keep your earnings up and your spending down and you invest the difference, like you will become free. And he was like not an aggressive investor, you know, or into tech or like these crazy outcomes by any means, but like even a diehard like Bogle, like just save and invest and compound and wait, is a huge lifestyle change before you even get to the like, okay, now let me try to find the one that's going to be like 100x in 10 years. Like that's a totally different game that, to your point, is like way more democratized now than it ever has been before. I mean, the 100-year scale of that is increasing democratization with like stock indexes and online brokerages. And now increasingly with like lowering accredited investor laws. You know, we had this kind of brief period where companies were going public later than they used to, but now we're seeing crypto come out and companies are like tokens, I suppose, which maybe the new form of equity that becomes predominant, is like liquid from day one or day negative 500, right? Like some of these companies are issuing tokens before they're even building a product or in order to fund the product. So that's going to really change the ability of the average person to access capital and the returns on that capital. Because yeah, I totally putting even $500 into Ethereum, you know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 7 years ago, would have had the same outcome, would have made you a free person. And like a lot more people have access to $500 and Ethereum than have ever, you know, had access to $100,000 and accredited like tier investments. So that is going to, I think, accelerate. And to your point of like the value of your judgment is going to, there's going to be less filters than ever on you being able to sort of capitalize to abuse the verb of the noun that we're already talking about on your judgment.
Yeah. And this is related to judgment specifically, but this is a clip that I randomly found that he once did on Periscope that I bet you will know what I'm talking about, and some of this may have resonated with you.
I hope so.
Watch this like maybe a dozen or so times, and the basic idea behind the clip was his 3 decision-making heuristics, right? And this is related to judgment calls. the one of the three that I probably have thought about more than any other, and I think this is applicable to really major decisions of your life, where to live, who to marry, who to date for a long time, what job to take, is if you cannot decide, the answer is no. Mm-hmm. And, I guess I just want to throw that one quote out there and see if that resonated with you as well, and how you interpret that in terms of either your own life or a general outlook. Like, to me, that was him saying, there's sort of an innate wisdom that human beings possess about their proper direction in life. And if you are at war with yourself, or you are, which is kind of by definition what uncertainty is not really having a clear signal, then the answer should be no. I throw that out there just in case anything about that sticks with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thing to hear, especially for like the young and hyperactive, which I was and probably still am. Yeah. There's this other, I can't remember who to attribute this quote to, but like, the truth of this has always sat with me too, that like all of mankind's suffering comes from the fact that we can't just sit in a chair in an empty room for 30 minutes.
Is that Pascal? I forget who said that. But anyways, yeah.
Maybe. Sounds good. Thanks for trying to save me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure.
And I think that like that kind of goes hand in hand with it. I don't know that that's what Naval was going for, but it is definitely like those ideas sit with each other. And when you see that you're like, the inability to sit still is driven by the like crazy voice in your head that you're like running from, that then causes you suffering, and pushes you into sort of to rush decisions that you shouldn't be making, or get you into situations that you're not hell yes about, often to the exclusion of things that may come along later that you would be hell yes about.
Yep.
Those all kind of fit together. And when you can see them stacking on top of each other, you're like, oh, that's how I ended up in this little mini shit show that I've gotten myself into. Yeah. And ended up, to your point, like either at war with yourself or feeling stuck or something like that. And I mean, a job search is like a decent metaphor for this. Like when you have no cushion, you have to take, whatever the first job that is offered to you. And if you had 6 months to search for a job and get 10 just job offers, you might find something that resonated with you much more deeply.
Yep.
But very few people have the cushion or savings or temperament, even, let's say, to like be willing to sit with uncertainty for 6 months and put that much work into it. And the same with starting a company, right? Like don't fucking start a company if with the first idea that pops into your head.
Yeah.
Like if you're going to spend 10 years working on that company, spend a year researching that idea and vetting it out, being sure that you don't have a better idea or a better approach. And that conflicts a little bit, in a paradoxical sense, that it is also true that like you can't perfectly research things. And sometimes you just have to start marching, and like you will find a local maximum. And there are secrets that are only accessible to people who have like earned and accumulated scars to like reach the thorny middle of the maze and like, pick up the treasure that lies there. So both approaches, I think, have worked for different people in different contexts. And, it's up to all of us to learn how to balance the paradox and apply the heuristics when they make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know when he was giving some additional context to that specific quote, if you cannot decide, the answer is no. One of the things I remember him saying is that unlike historic times or evolutionary times for people, we live in an era of option, a level of options for people that is very difficult for us to understand as people. As one example, it used to be oftentimes if you passed on a mate who you dated for a long time, that may have been your sole opportunity to have kids or to pass along your genes. And the same thing with jobs, that they were a lot more difficult to connect with recruiters at one period of time not too long ago. And that I think we misunderstand how many options there are, provided we do have the temperament and the ability, as you said, to kind of wait for something that does feel right for us.
Yeah, I mean, it's been 10 minutes on Tinder, and that'll cure you of that. The illusion that you only have, 4 options in life. The flip side of that is just as dangerous, I think, which is that, like, oh my God, there's this massive paradox of choice. There's millions of people, and you try to over optimize and basically like never move forward with any decision because you are paralyzed by the number of options and the inability to move forward and just commit to a path. And I think, both are dangerous and pernicious in their own ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll briefly say the other 2 decision-making heuristics. You're obviously welcome to comment on them. And then there's a subject I really want to talk to you about. The other 2 that I remember is, if you are faced with a choice that, seems to be about 50-50, you're not exactly sure what to do, that he indicated once that what you want to do is choose the decision that is more painful in the short term, because what is in his mind happening in circumstances like that is basically pain avoidance, that you're trying to kind of push off the difficult situation that you have to put yourself through in order to move forward. The other decision-making heuristic I remember him once saying is that when faced with difficult decisions, you want to make the decision that makes you more, the word he used was equanimous, basically peaceful or at peace in the long run, right? Like you want to have a long-term perspective, which I think I've also heard him say is essentially what all of wisdom boils down to, is choosing a long-term view versus a short-term view.
Yeah, understanding the consequences of your actions, I think, was like the succinct definition of wisdom. And judgment was just wisdom applied to external circumstances, external decisions. Yeah, I mean, I think those are good heuristics. I mean, the danger of heuristics is like they sound good when you read them, and they're never there when you need them. When you're actually like making the decision, and you're like, oh shit. If I had this book open in front of my face when I was making this decision, I would have chosen differently. And so it was just that process of like working these into your head and, translating them into like the habits, the typical one for choose the thing that's hard in the short term is like, go work out every day. Yeah. Like, is it easier every day to choose to not work out? Yeah. Is it easier to like punt out that hard conversation that you really need to have with your kids or spouse or partner or parent? Like, it's definitely easier to not have it today, but are you just making this moment easier for yourself? Like, yeah, probably. And will your life be better after that hard conversation? Yeah, probably. So pushing yourself to recognize those hesitations and work through them. I think totally valid. Yeah. It's not to say like be a masochist about everything ever. Because there's definitely like some ways to make your life, like, is it easier to invest in Amazon? Like, yeah. Should you do it? Like, fuck yeah. Like, don't make your life harder intentionally, but be willing to suffer through things that need to be suffered through to get the result that you want to get. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. The area that this is actually what triggered me reaching out to you was, so I'm on your email list as well. And so I get your kind of updates from additional source material from Naval, and the one, and I have heard him recently. He's done some Clubhouse conversations, and I've noticed a theme when there's a public Q&A with him that people seem to be often increasingly interested in his views on matters of the heart, matters of personal relationships. And again, I think it's in part because there's such a void in our culture for sane, timeless wisdom related, like applied wisdom to friendships, to marriage, to relationships, to dating. This is a tech multimillionaire we're talking about, right? But he has gained the trust and interest of a lot of people who I have seen want to solicit him for advice in that realm. I think because they just trust his mind and they trust his honesty. And it was about a month ago, I think, that I got an email from you related to his views. I forget exactly what it was titled, but it was something related to relationships. And there were some quotes that you included in there about him. And I know that we're probably relatively close to winding the conversation down, and I wanted to give ample time to kind of flesh this out, this area of his mind, from your perspective in terms of what you've gleaned from him as it applies to human relationships and just relationships in general, that he might have some ideas or some insight that might be helpful to people generally.
Yeah, I definitely experience the same. I get a fair number of emails asking for links and resources and stuff about these topics too. And I think you're right. As people have listened to him for a while and be like, wow, he's been right about a lot of stuff, or I agree with his views on a lot of stuff. And this is an area that, I'm struggling with. So maybe I should see if he's got something to share. There's not a lot from him, in the whole corpus of his work about relationships. And I think he would say probably similar to Hell. He's like, look, maybe I've figured some of this out for myself, but I do not feel the level of confidence that I feel that I have understood the principles to the point where I can share them broadly and feel comfortable with hundreds of thousands or millions of people following my advice. That is a high bar. And I know that Naval has deep respect for the, people who listen to him and take his advice seriously. I think that's a heavy burden. And I think what I've heard him say about his principles for wealth specifically, but I think it applies to happiness too. He's like, I basically have boiled this down as deep as I can to the point where these are fundamental truths and principles that will basically never be wrong. Some of them may or may not apply to you in your circumstance, and the order may be important, and you may have to kind of tweak them in order to fit them into your world. If you're, in a village in India instead of in San Francisco, I think the principle would still apply, even though the example may be different. And I think the challenge of that, and that may be an impossibility in the realm of relationships, right? But that's the standard, the intellectual standard that he holds himself to when he puts forth a principle like this. And so it may be an impossibility to reach that on relationships. It may be that it takes 10 more years of work, and it hasn't happened yet, or isn't something that he does. It may be that we are all so deeply, weirdly unique in our own ways and relationships that it's just not, that there are no principles that culturally and, age and emotional and experience and upbringing are all such a weird combination of circumstance that it's not, there's just too much hubris in any sort of prescription at any level. So that is my long, hopefully deft dodge of that question, but with enough context to maybe say there's a reason that it's not there.
Mm-hmm. And from you, and I know that in that email that I got from you, that one of the things that I remember him mentioning, because he is married, and I think he doesn't speak often about his relationship, his personal life with his family and with his wife. But I do think one thing I have gotten from him is it seemed like at one point in his life, he was either engaged or close to getting married and did not. And then later in his life did. And he said something once that I remember hearing, which is that he has great confidence that he and his wife are it wouldn't make sense to him for them to ever separate because their values simply align so closely. And that carried a lot of the weight for them of just maintaining a healthy relationship. And I think one of the quotes that I think I ended up putting up on my website, which you included in that letter, was related to trying. And that in his estimation, that especially early in dating someone, his view is that, I'd never heard anyone quite put it this way, that your job is ironically to be very selfish and not arrogant, not an asshole, but just to be authentically you. And that a lot of times people put on. It's very natural, I think, as a human being to want to be a better version of yourself around someone you're interested in, and then eventually you just can't sustain that. And so I think his general point was like, if you can just stick to who you basically are, and your job is to essentially find the puzzle piece in which that aligns as closely as you possibly can.
Yeah, that may be the only principle that there is. And it's funny that, like, that is born of such a long-term view. Like, if you want this to be a lifelong relationship, do not engage in any behavior that you do not consider sustainable for your whole life, especially early in a relationship, because you're basically making a false promise, either to yourself or to your partner or both. And I think that is the perfect kind of pithy that, like, yeah, nobody else would say that. I mean, or what's weird and what I love about so much of what Naval does is, like, there's a folk saying for that, which is like, just be yourself.
Yeah.
And everyone's like, the classic advice that everybody gives each other: if you're nervous for a first date, just be yourself. Yeah. What the fuck does that mean? And like, why? Like, what is good about that? And then you hear Naval kind of like recompile it in his own like iron prescription kind of way. That's like, no, like, don't do anything unsustainable or inauthentic, or don't audition. Don't put on a face. Don't like pretend to have opinions that you don't have, or don't not have opinions that you do have, or like, just like, don't change a thing that you're not willing to change forever. And like, now when you hear just be yourself, if you have this like chunk of wisdom from Naval, you hear something totally different than somebody who just says like this kind of throwaway wisdom that there's deep truth to, if you can expand that into the rest of the context. But I feel like so few people do. We've lost the root folder that folk wisdom refers to now, and that this is a helpful way to maybe get some of that back.
Yeah, dude, I think that's perfectly said. I'd never heard about that phrase and kind of tweaked it with that additional context there.
Dude, you hear those all through the book. The more of them, like, I didn't do this intentionally, but like, there's like, entrepreneurs should seek risk. Like, that's reformulated into take on accountability. You don't want risk, you want accountability. Like, that's a very nuanced thing. It takes money to make money. Apply capital leverage, right? Like, there's all of these sort of, I don't know, folk sayings, for lack of a better term, that are like true, but have lost the context that make them helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. Another one that comes to mind as you mentioned that is him. I remember him talking about, because there is something deeply Buddhist about a lot of the stuff that he says as well. Like, there's definitely a flavor of that.
It's a beautiful blend of like East and West, I think, in his like studies, Eastern philosophy and Indian influences, and philosophers like Osho and, reads Buddha, but like also very Western, very American, very capitalist, and very tech forward. Like, the blend of those things, I feel like, is so helpful for so many people in this kind of like this newly remixed world.
Yeah. Yeah, and to that point, I studied Buddhism when I was in college quite a bit, and a common Buddhist pithy statement is life is suffering. And I remember Naval saying, and he's very big into the idea that ethical wealth creation is possible, and that if you despise people who make money, you will never be a person who ends up making money, right? Not for the purpose of self-aggrandizement or hedonic treadmill lifestyles, but for freedom. And I remember him saying that adopting a principle like life is suffering is basically playing life on hard mode. That if you do become an ascetic and you don't need anything at all, that you need no material possessions, you can have your freedom because you have no expenses, but your life is going to be quite difficult. There is something to, again, like blending that East and West. There's something there in both elements, right? That I feel like it's the blend of the two that, to me, it makes for probably a better life, undoubtedly, if you can live it with that kind of mismatch.
Yeah, which is like I find it interesting, and I didn't realize this until I was kind of done with this, but how few books address both wealth and happiness together. And even though this book does not really like attempt in any way to mash the two together, it does give you perspectives on both, and you can kind of come away with a different relationship between the two, right? So I think this, like, there's a lot of books about wealth, and there's a lot of books about happiness, but there's very few that like even implicitly show you the relationship between the two and the levers that you have and the spectrum that this can take place across. To your point, you can be an ascetic monk and like have nothing, want nothing, spend your whole life reducing your desires, and there's a path to happiness there by foregoing all wealth. There is also, on the total other side, a path to like total misery and massive wealth, where if you never create a gap between what you have and what you want, you will maximize your misery, even if you maximize your physical comfort. And at any point in between, as long as you nurture and expand that gap between your desires and your reality, you can be a happy person, whether you have very, very little or a lot, as long as you understand and create that gap. The relationship between your desires and your happiness and your current sort of level of material wealth are all in this state of flux together, and they have these relationships with each other that are important for you to understand, and your perspective on them is more important even than what they are to your own lived experience.
Yeah. There are two things I want to address and talk about before we close this down. And the first is related to how this whole process and how these ideas have affected you, how you feel like you have developed, grown, changed through doing all of this research. And
so fucking enlightened now. Just a radiant ball of enlightenment. This is Buddhism in one swing.
Well, that's obvious talking to you for an hour and a half that's going on. But how do you think this has affected you, right? Like, the idea to me of a great book and great ideas is that they kind of make you better. They upgrade you. They change they clarify the world in a way that often simplifies things not in a way that's perfect, but just is kind of directing you in a more accurate trajectory. How do you think you've been influenced by all of this work, all of these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little, it was so gradual over time that it's hard to know for sure. Like it's definitely like a frog in a pot, and it's subtle. But I like, part of what motivated me to do this project is like incepting these ideas into my head. And when you publish them, you also feel some pressure to live up to them. And it, puts you in this spot where you really want to live the principles that you've learned. Like anything else, it is a long, hard process, and nobody is perfect. And it is, step by step, day by day, 3 steps forward, 5 steps back, 2 steps sideways, and then like you miss a day. So it like, I don't want to give anybody some impression that I am by any means fucking enlightened. But it is felt like a step in multiple right directions. And I feel like I have, more clarity of path maybe. And I understand the equation more than I used to. That doesn't, I feel like I've got a map, and that doesn't necessarily mean I like walk the perfect path every day or every month or even year. But I at least understand how to self-correct and, when might be going wrong. And so I maybe spend less time being lost or confused, about being on path or off path. It has made me, more patient. It's made me, I would say maybe the overarching thing is it's given me more agency, right? It's made me much better at, though far from perfect at, blaming myself when I would have formerly blamed, anything in the external world for some perceived slight or injustice or, unhappiness or whatever. I just spend a lot more time focused on my locus of control, and at the same time, like, becoming increasingly aware that my locus of control is much smaller than, my 21-year-old self would have thought that it is. And both of those things combined, I don't know, it is simplifying, and there's been more time like kind of being peaceful, and more time prizing freedom, and less time desiring new things, and more time actually like trying to change my environment and my mindset in order to desire less things, right? Like, I don't have Instagram on my phone because I know that is like basically engineered to create as many new desires as possible in a 10-second window, because that's how they make money, and like is the dopamine hit of creating new desires. And that is what every influencer is rewarded for who's posting content on there. It's what every advertiser is rewarded for. It's what Instagram itself is rewarded for. And recognizing that for what it is, and prioritizing health, and prioritizing the peaceful moments, and just getting that Naval's voice in my head. Like, I've probably read this book 20 times in the process of creating it, and so I feel like I've got a little voice in my head that's like, is this aligning with your values? Is this how you want to be spending your time? And so it's changed my arrangement and my level of sensitivity to recognizing self-conflict and correcting course.
Yeah. Before I ask you the last question of the conversation, I just want to again express thanks to you for doing this. I wasn't a part of that initial Twitter poll where you got a lot of enthusiasm, but I certainly was one of these people out there, and I think there are a lot of us who have really gotten a lot from him, and wanted something exactly like what you produced. And I remember learning initially about this book that you were putting together and thinking, man, that is something I would have loved to have had the opportunity to do, because I think it's just extremely important. And I know how hard it fucking is to do that. And so I just want to take a moment to thank you for doing it, because I think a lot of people, the best idea of, or the best books and the hope of the information age that we're living in is that it does make hope, in the best sense. It can help people feel a little less lost and a little less confused, and feel a bit more agency, because they have kind of downloaded the best that's available out there. And I think I just intuitively, we probably both got the sense that Naval was hitting on things that were maybe we had never heard of before, but just resonated in a way. It's like when someone says something clearly and truly that you had kind of weirdly already known but had never been exposed to before, you're like, that's it. That's exactly what my experience has been.
Yeah, you're kind of like primed for some of these things. And sometimes it's just like, I've been picking up pieces of this idea, and Naval just like drops the keystone in the arch, and you're like, oh, the whole thing comes together, and I remember it all with this one pithy thing that he shared. And he's like really good at dropping those, which really helps. But no, I appreciate your appreciation. I do think that the book is the book at large, not just this book. Books are an amazing technology, and for everything that is going on, there's still something to be said for like, a $15 book that carries the wealth of someone's entire life and wisdom, and that you can sit down and read in 4 hours and have a map for living the whole rest of your life. And I have a huge respect for what kind of Wait But Why calls like the human colossus, which is like all of this like accumulated wisdom that we are all contributing to and pulling from. And I spent a lot of my life reading and learning and listening to people who were, decades ahead of me, and trying to contribute to the value that is in that like pool of our species, and kind of keep passing that all back. And I should say on that note that like this book is very much a public service. Like, it is available for free in all of its digital formats, including audio. So if you do not have like financial or physical access to this book in any country or place in the world, like if you can get onto a computer, you can get access to this information. And I do like think that the depth of and clarity of Naval's principles are such that every human on earth can benefit from at least one and potentially like 10 different ideas in this book. And that I hope it in some small way changes the course of many, many people's lives. I feel lucky to be a steward of Naval's work. Cause all of the brilliance is really his. I truly like had amazing pieces to work with and just tried to pick the best ones and, throw them in the wind in such a way that like they reach everybody who they can benefit.
Yeah. Amazing. I did. And we will link in the show notes and in the description, for the show when it comes out to all of that so that people have an easy way through the show to be able to access that content. The last thing I want to ask you, and we have dug into many of the ideas that are in the book related to wealth, to happiness, to health. What else? What have I not asked you that you think really matters or is important that has stuck with you or you think are key insights? Prefacing that with the knowledge that really reading the book and probably rereading it is the only way to get the key components. But what else is coming to mind, if anything, that is important to articulate here?
What we've done here is really spend 2 hours with like getting me to poorly paraphrase what Naval has put perfectly in the book. So if you have made it this far, like, please like stop listening to me and just go listen to Naval. Cause he said it all first and all better. I think the only thing that comes to mind is like, I may be reiterating that like happiness isn't a choice. It is a choice, but it is a skill, and like it is a learned skill. Your level of happiness is malleable and increasable. That's not to tritely say it's easy and that you should be able to flip a switch and be happy, but it is to say that like there is always hope for becoming a happier person if you work at it. And this book will give you some ways to work at it, some very practical levels. And the other is like, Naval is who he is because he is a voracious reader. And he says in the book, just read. Like anything that you're excited to read, just read and keep reading. And if you slow down for a second, like put it down and pick up something else that you're excited to read, there's a whole section at the end of the book of all of the stuff that Naval recommends reading. It's a great place to start if you don't know what else to start with. But yeah, he truly like, he is who he is because of all of the stuff that he has read that has come before him. And if you want to, I don't know, if you resonate with these ideas and if you want to go to their source, like I encourage you to go to their source and like get as close to the primary materials as you can and interpret them your own way and recompile for yourself. Yeah.
Eric, this has been an amazing conversation. And I just want to say again, thank you for your efforts. I know how painful it is to do what you did, and at least in some small way, I understand. And thank you for persevering, and thank you for making it available in the way that you stated earlier. I think it is a public service, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and that was a condition of Naval's that I am overjoyed to have done and seen the results of. Probably over 1 million people now have read free versions, and there's still like many thousands of people buying the physical versions and the audiobook versions and stuff like that. So I received plenty of support and appreciate all of it. But I want to give Naval full credit for that condition. It was fun work, and there's people, it sounds like, on your podcast who are doing much harder and more noble work than I am. So it is an honor to be in the metaphorical digital room with some of the other people on this podcast, and like that. Yeah, I will dive deep on some of your other episodes, and if people are interested in this, I'm sure they should too.
Thank you, brother. Dude, this is really great. It was great to meet you, man.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Good talk.
Bye, bud. Take care, man. See ya. Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you are finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/keeptalkingpodcast. I truly appreciate all of you who are supporting the show.